Welcome to Work from the Inside Out, a podcast that highlights real-life stories, practical strategies, and best practices for transitioning your career from unhappiness and dissatisfaction to fulfillment, meaning, and joy. Now here is your host, career and executive coach, Tammy Guler-Loeb.
Hey, everybody. I am so excited to introduce my guest today, Laura Spero. Laura is a clinical social worker who has worked in quite an array of roles. She's worked in the public health field in Nepal, as an arts consultant in public schools in New York, in a holistic physical therapy practice, and all of this pointing to generally in human services. Today, she's in the Boston area working as a medical social worker in a hospital setting and as a clinical social worker and therapist in a women's prison reentry program. Please join me in welcoming Laura Spero. Welcome, Laura.
Thank you so much, Tammy. It's great to be here.
I am so happy to have you here. Laura, so as you know, on Work from the Inside Out, we really like to start at the beginning and talk about some of the early years and how those may or may not have been formative in what you're doing now. I mean, you've done so many different interesting things over the years and are continuing to. So take us back to some of the earlier years and share a few tidbits with us.
I would say these tidbits kind of fall under a banner of, I think a lot of my career has been around making things that seem like they have absolutely nothing to do with each other, have to do with each other in kind of surprising and interesting ways. And as you said, kind of in the human services and just an interest in people and cultures and the helping professions. So I grew up, in Maryland, I would say an upper middle class Jewish family. I had very good schooling. I come from a family of entrepreneurs and advocates. My dad and a lot of my both of my aunts started their own kind of thing and ran it for their careers. My mom was a consumer rights advocate who actually worked closely with Ralph Nader back in the 70s.
Oh, so wow.
I definitely grew up in a family of people who kind of get out there and look at stuff and start stuff and find problems and then try to solve problems and debate about them at the dinner table. And there's a lot of kind of throwing things around and, messy ideas. And so I was acculturated to that early, which I learned later, not everybody is. And maybe sometimes you just need to chill out. So that was, that came eventually. But when I was applying to social work school and I thought a lot about sort of a formative story for me, this is the one that I came up with, which really, it really sticks with me. I remember in the very first house we lived in, that we moved out of when I was 4. In that neighborhood, there was a 4th of July parade every year. And one year, so I couldn't have been more than 4. So say I was 3, old enough to remember, but I was riding on one of the floats because it was probably a very small parade, but I was very small. So to me, it seemed very big. For all I know, it was a bunch of trucks driving around the neighborhood. But I was on this kind of flatbed float thing.
Wow.
And a teenager who must have been one of my neighbors somehow fell off and was kind of sitting on the road, and the float rolled onto his foot. And there's something about that moment where I was in this situation, watching somebody pinned and hurting, and I was unable to do anything. And I was just, panicked that the float needed to move and the kid couldn't move. And I was just a little 3-year-old.
Wow.
And I feel like there's something about that. He was fine. The float moved and he was okay. And, he probably had some good bruising on his foot. But that story, that moment impacted me to a degree that I still remember it today. I'm sure it was scary, but my overwhelming feeling was, I can't do anything about this. Something needs to happen. This is not okay. And the feeling of kind of, helplessness of being a small child in that situation. So that's one of my early stories. I had a very nice childhood. I realize now that I tell that story. And I would say as a kid, I was a very, on one hand, very intense. I was an athlete. I was fairly intense and competitive athlete. But I was also, I loved arts and crafts. We had a room in the basement where I would go down there and sort of apply that same intensity that I might have as an athlete to some very intricate art project.
Wow.
And I would spend hours and hours and hours and hours down there in the art room. Like I was the, 12-year-old who would go and just disappear in the basement in the summer for the entire day, like scratching somebody's name into a piece of wood.
Wow. So everything and in terms of the athletic side of you, were those team sports or were you doing more individual kinds of things? I'm curious.
That's a very interesting question. And this definitely comes into play when I start thinking of myself in the working world. I'm a unique combination of both. So I should say my father was an Olympic rower. He rowed in the 94 Olympics, so I grew up around rowing and I rowed in college. And I did a lot of different sport. I played soccer. I was a competitive swimmer. I was most talented at rowing because I came by it honestly. But, those are sports. Well, soccer is very much a team sport, but I think the sports that I excelled at the most were sports where it's a team sport, but you have a very, but you also really have to do your own part in a very well-defined way. So endurance sports, rowing is probably the best example, you and your oar, but at the same time, there's no team sport that's more team than rowing because pretty much one person stops rowing, the entire boat falls over. So,
right.
Yeah, I think I love team sports. I love teamwork. But I also thrive when I really can cultivate my relationship to my role. When you think of that same intensity that I had as a kid, like sitting and making, some sign for my mom's office, like
right.
To be able to do that with respect to my contribution to the team. That varies from one, team sport to the next.
That's why I was asking because when you were describing, I almost felt like I could almost envision you as that 12-year-old, trying to create that image and that piece for the office or that piece and envisioning how you were envisioning somebody having that in their office, that art project, and doing that very individually for that other person versus being, kind of a competitive athlete. And there'd be a big difference between being on a swim team, which while it is a team sport, there is that individual piece of trying to beat your own time or being a runner. Not that you said anything about running, but there's a difference between that and being a soccer player where there really is a very obvious interdependence of being on a team when you play soccer. And so I was just curious about that dynamic for you and you explained it beautifully, the way you said that, cultivating your role, because there is a difference when you're doing something by yourself and trying to perfect or improve your own craft or your own skill versus doing something where you're part of the whole. So I thought that was interesting, the way you engaged with those things.
Yeah, it's a very poignant part when I think of my working life as well, of trying to, modulating that piece. Like there's a part of me that kind of needs to take something and run with it, and it needs a runway. But at the same time, as you get more mature, you figure out how to bring supports onto that runway and make sure you're focused on that runway. And I think the same is true for me in sport. The team is very important to me. My core closest group of friends that are basically my family and my tribe is my crew team, from college. I also I think it brings out the best in me when I have space to tap into that thing that brings me that focus and that drive. And not different sports allow for that in different ways, and different jobs allow for that in different ways.
Sure. Absolutely. So take us forward now. We have the artist, the athlete, the intense competitor, and yet I'm sitting here talking to you, and I don't feel an intensity about you just talking to you, which is an interesting experience. I think it's a really interesting piece, and then you're the storyteller too. So where does the story go from here?
Well, so let's talk about one more piece, which is the advocate.
Yes.
As I say, just the family culture that I grew up in involved a lot of discussion of issues and debate and being engaged in sort of, social discussions. It was the 90s. So my dad was a tech entrepreneur and started a tech company that did quite well called Fusion Systems that made, a type of like UV technology. And when I was about, I'm going to say maybe I was 4 or 5. So we're talking like mid 80s. His product was effectively stolen and the patent violated by Mitsubishi in Japan. They had operations in Japan. And at the time, this was a thing that happened fairly regularly, actually, that very large overseas companies sort of railroaded small businesses in the US and pretty much it's hard to put up a fight until you meet my dad, married to my mom, who's a consumer rights lawyer.
Oh,
and
right.
A lot of my early childhood was taken up with them. Essentially, they ended up testifying before Congress and getting some international patent law changed, and they won. So Mitsubishi did not take over my dad's company, and they were featured on 60 Minutes. It was just a very exciting time, that I watched my family address that injustice, this stealing of intellectual property. Everybody at my dad's company presumably would have lost their jobs if that had happened. And, I remember we've talked about it a lot since. It's obviously part of the family lore, but, as I've gotten older, I've understood ways in which my dad said, listen, we can talk with them about if this is best for our shareholders, then we can do X, Y, and Z in the best interest of the company. But it has to happen in a just and ethical way that, protects the interests of the people here. And it's just wrong. Like stealing is wrong. And so even though I wouldn't say I grew up to be kind of a hardcore capitalist, I would say that, that was a defining experience, I think, of our childhood, me and my brother, of being a part of that and feeling the pride that, our parents were willing to stand up for this and sort of engage the public good in our systems and be involved in setting up better structures for, other people coming along too.
Absolutely. I can imagine that was a lot to witness on many levels.
It gave me a model for a way of being in the world. If I think back to the story of the float, where there's sort of a dynamic of something is not okay here, and I feel impotent to do something about it. But then it's just, it gave me a model for sort of where my parameters for fear are and where my ethics are, and, tools that are available. I recognize I'm telling all of this from a very specific vantage point of a fairly privileged, well-educated family in a certain setting. But I think that these are things that did very much affect me and make me think about my place in the world.
Absolutely. And I think the fact that you even make that comment says something there, that this was your experience. This was the life that you lived, but also you learned a lot from it. And it sounds like you haven't taken that for granted. And, when you think about a big, company like Mitsubishi, the fact that your parents fought, they didn't give in, they won, that's a big deal, I think. on a lot of levels. And there are a lot of very privileged people who could have easily lost in that situation. And they were able to make something happen that protected a lot of people's jobs and also fought an injustice that happened. And even if it was a privileged injustice is injustice. I don't know if you agree with that, but it does seem pretty remarkable to me, because how many things do we see in this day and age in the world of commerce, in the world of work, where things happen that people feel so powerless. And here's something, like you said, this is not right. And they were able to use their skills, their fortitude, and their talents and their resources to be able to correct it, and use it for good. And so I think it's an uplifting story in that so often I think people don't think those things are possible.
Yeah, I think that's well put. I think it helped define some of my underlying belief systems about big things, like what's possible, what to be afraid of, how to see my role in the world. Some of the things that I think sometimes stand in our way when we're unsure about how to proceed or how to encounter a situation. I think some of my reference points were fairly bold. And, so if anything, sometimes maybe I was too presumptuous. But, on the flip side of that, I think it's also given me some confidence to throw myself into situations and do my best to figure it out and figure out how to be a good contributor where I can.
Well, and here you are, grown up with your own family and having done a lot of different jobs and living in various parts of the world and having, we're talking about you being 5 to 10 years old when these things happened. How many 5 or 10-year-olds, are thinking about their privilege, right? Or
I don't think I was thinking about it at that time.
No, you weren't. How could you?
Constructing.
No, I'm just saying, like, you can only think about some of those things in a more reflective manner because you just don't, you don't know anything else is my point. Like, how could you know other than, wow, my mom's a fighter, or my mom is fighting for, something that's wrong here and I'm proud of her, or my dad is, making sure that his company can go forward. Those are proud moments for a young child. They don't know the difference between that your parents had resources and the ability to make these things happen versus if this had happened to somebody else under different circumstances. How would a 5 or 10-year-old know that, right? So, but my point, is that everything's a reference point depending on where you're at in your life too, right? But it's an interesting juxtaposition that you even had that experience in those young years, right? So, and I'm just amazed at all you've done all these years already. So I leave it to you, the storyteller, to take us further along in the story here now.
Yeah, well, so I'll kind of fast forward through most of the rest of the story. I was very adventurous. I wanted to see other parts of the world. I loved to travel. I loved the outdoors. I really loved the mountains. I knew Mount Everest was in Nepal. And I also kind of had an ongoing interest in various aspects of Eastern cultures, Eastern healing, philosophy, but it was pretty poorly defined. It was just kind of a little bit stereotypical and generalized. I just got a bee in my bonnet that I wanted to go to Nepal, and I think there was an aspect where, on some level, that I've only come to understand later through a lot of retrospective study of myself and understanding the world better. I think there's a way in which I wanted to break out of the confines of the very advantaged life that I had, because I didn't really understand how it fit in to something. And my only way of thinking about that was, I want to go somewhere in the mountains and volunteer somewhere doing something. I don't highly recommend this as an approach. Like, the adventurousness, great, I've had to come to terms with a lot of the problems that exist around, that kind of industry of people like me going and volunteering in Nepal right after college. So, I recognize that there's a lot of complication there, but there was also something very deep in me that they wanted to explore. And one of the things that I would be curious to talk with you about today is, some of the maybe it's generational, I don't know exactly, but some of the anxiety around kind of being raised in a way where the whole world is at your feet. Like you can do anything, you can be whatever you want, you can change the world, and then you graduate from college and you actually still really don't know anything.
Right.
I mean, you're lucky enough to get to go to college, but I think probably a lot of your listeners will relate to, without, knowing exactly, I would say probably there are a lot of people who listen to your show that can relate to some pieces of this. And,
right.
And I think that there's a lot of, in retrospect, I think that was very intimidating and difficult for me to kind of shed over the years in terms of the expectation of myself that, everything needs to be like major, like take on Mitsubishi, like have some brilliant idea, because I still didn't actually really know anything. And we popularized in our culture a lot of those sort of heroic stories. And without understanding that this was the case, I think there's a way in which I felt accountable to some of those mythical, impossible things that I was fully unequipped for. So I think a lot of my journey in Nepal was about growing up a second time in a completely new place, in an underprivileged environment where my proportional, my relative power and privilege couldn't have been more obvious. Like it wasn't confusing for me to see. And even then I still learn about, every day, get new insights and vantage points. And at the same time, I have built beautiful relationships in Nepal. So my journey to Nepal started off as a volunteer, in a school teaching, kind of doing what people do, and evolved through collaborating with another teacher and members of the community to start this dental health program, which, today has grown to essentially be, it's called Javaya Foundation. And we basically establish rural dental clinics and oral health programs that work in schools and community spaces. This evolved completely because I was living in this community at age 22 with a liberal arts degree with no skills. And people were coming to me with dental problems, to which, of course, I said, I don't really know anything about that, but sure, I'll try. So you see what I mean in terms of the sort of double-edged sword, because there were a lot of mistakes that were made along the way.
Sure.
And I think the burden of that should not have to fall on a, vulnerable, marginalized population in poverty in Nepal. And at the same time, I was willing to give it a try. And I think that the result, because I stuck with it and because I had built relationships, is different than other types of programs that we see in that space. And I do think that benefits people. So that's complicated. And it usually doesn't take me this long to get to this point in the story. But when I went to Nepal, I ended up basically moving in with a widow and her two daughters who were my age. So I was 22. Vishnu and Didi were 20 and 24 at the time. And then their mom, who I call Amma, and we lived in this 2-room plastered mud home. And I went initially for a couple of months, and then I went back and stayed for a year. And Amma called me yesterday at work at the hospital from her house in Nepal. We're very close. I still stay there. It's 20 years later. My older sister Didi's children, I consider my nephews.
Yeah.
My kids are considered that, they call each other family names. So I really became embedded in a household and in a community there, which was my anchor, to everything. And while I was I didn't live continuously in Nepal. This was my early 20s, and I lived there for a period of time that I would go back and forth. And so alongside, over that period of time, I had other jobs. The first one was at StoryCorps when I was 25, and it sort of falls into the same theme of, for anyone who's never listened to StoryCorps, go right now to storycorps.org. And
we'll include some links to that too. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I was a facilitator. So it's basically where people bring in a loved one and they do an interview with them for 40 minutes. And my job was to do what you're doing right now, which is operate the recording equipment and occasionally throw in a question and sort of help provide a guide and then do some audio editing. And so I listened at the age of 25, I had the chance to listen to hundreds of people reflect on their lives. And I was stationed for a while at Ground Zero in New York. I was in New Orleans just after Hurricane Katrina, doing StoryCorps as a facilitator. So it sort of exposed me to the opportunity to just listen and to hear other people answer the question, what's been most important to you in life? What are you most proud of? Do you have any regrets? Like I listened to hundreds of people answer that question to their child or to the guy who, they bought donuts from every Sunday. Or it was just an incredibly formative and beautiful and rich experience. And I learned a lot about myself through that. Because I
bet. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, one of my conclusions was it's important to me to have a family, however that comes about. I could see myself running through and doing one thing and the next thing, and then, not doing that. And so I'm going to probably at some point have to, at a very inconvenient time, make sure that, and that's in no way saying that it's better to do or not do. My point is what I learned about what mattered to me, and sort of reflected on how that fit into my, like, how am I going to talk about myself, when I'm 75 and somebody's asking me like, Grandma, what's the most important lesson you've learned in life? What's your happiest memory? What are you most proud of? It really gave me a lot to think about. It was a beautiful experience.
Yeah.
And then I had
how long were you with StoryCorps for?
About, I want to say a year and a half or 2 years. It was right when StoryCorps was starting, like 2005 and 2006.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow. It sounds like a very robust couple of years.
It was. I really can't recommend StoryCorps enough. You too can have this experience if you just listen to to go to the website and listen to the little clips of the interviews. It's wonderful. But I guess, I want to, because I really want to make sure to have time to sort of talk like about some of the bigger themes involved. And what I would say is, like during this period of time from sort of my early 20s until my late 30s, I was working on building this organization in Nepal. I was spending part of every year in Nepal. I was working on a topic area in Nepal that turns out to be very technical, in which I had no background training, not a dentist or a public health expert, but I was getting to know Nepal very well. So I was kind of negotiating all of that. I ended up finding myself running a project and then a nonprofit and raising money and sort of things that built on themselves and happened because one thing led to the next, but not because I sat around saying, I want to start and run a foundation, I don't really, and then having these other jobs alongside it, like StoryCorps, like LEAP, which is an educational nonprofit I worked for in New York City, where I would go to different public schools and develop educational arts programs for them. And then as I said, I had a long-term interest in alternative medicine and sort of Eastern philosophy. So I ended up taking training in a type of holistic therapy that led me to work in a clinic for 3 years, that was just such a formative experience as well. These are all, like, each one of these also encapsulated a whole new way of looking at things and understanding things. And then I was kind of getting to my late 30s and I was like, okay, I'm running this nonprofit. I have to fundraise. I have to sit in front of spreadsheets. I have to have Skype meetings. And this started because I was living with Amma and Didi and Vishnu, and the neighbor was coming over with a toothache. And it was like me being on the float, looking at the guy being like, I have to try to do something.
Right. This is not right.
Right. But it had moved into, partly by virtue of success, like now my role is kind of as a project manager and administrator and a fundraiser and to think about my website and all this stuff that's just not really my core skill set or my core, like I was muscling through it. And in addition to that, I was really feeling the kind of loneliness of where I belonged in the professional world. So when I say I had to grow up a second time, it's like, almost like grew backwards into a stage of life where I was just thrilled to be able to enter a conventional job setting as the new person and be like, great, somebody tell me what to do.
Wow.
I had to do this whole lap going through Nepal and, New York City and StoryCorps and all of these things. And that I grew so much from that, but I felt like a lot of the growth that I had experienced in building this program and learning to form relationships and the cultural and linguistic aspects, the sort of rigorous aspects, I just felt tired. I felt like, how do I want to actually spend my day? I've been really sort of up here in the mission of things, but that mission is causing me to spend a huge amount of time alone at home on my computer, doing things that I don't really like doing very much. And I really enjoyed the work that I did in the physical therapy clinic, doing this holistic, it's called integrative manual therapy. And I loved that work, but I didn't have the appropriate licensures to practice on my own. Like I had to be, in that setting, and then that setting changed and I couldn't practice there anymore. And so when I was 35, the question was like, what do I do now? Do I try to get an additional license so that I can practice integrative manual therapy, or do I do something else? And I had this like conglomeration of seemingly random, unrelated experiences. I had spent a huge amount of time developing expertise where it was unclear exactly what bucket that expertise fit into. I was kind of overwhelmed about where do I go from here? And I'm thinking those questions like, well, how am I going to think? What was most important to me? How did I use my time? What did I want to do? And I get caught up there. And then I remember one day going, how do I want to spend my day? When I sit down for dinner, what do I want to have done that day?
I love that.
And I made a list. I wrote it down. And my list was what do I think I'm good at / enjoy doing? And sort of where are my limitations? And that could either be things I think I'm not that great at or things I don't enjoy. So on my list of things that I wanted to be doing, work as part of a team, have a varied schedule and varied day. Each day is a little bit different. And over the course of the day, it's not monotonous. The right level of people interaction. So like teaching was too much, but sitting at my computer all day alone was not enough. And I actually used IMT as a reference point, the physical therapy, because I was like, why do I enjoy this job? What do I enjoy? It modulated well so that I had the right amount of social interaction, but a lot of time to be in my own space, which kind of goes back to what we were talking about before, like with sports.
Yes, right. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I need to have a mission. Like this, my work needs to be about a bigger idea. That's very motivating and important to me. I don't want to sit all day. Like stuff that you think may be sort of peripheral when you're choosing your, but actually, if you're sitting all day and you don't want to sit all day, that affects you every day, all the time.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
So then I made a list of things like that I don't want to do. And I was like, I don't want to be in front of a computer all day. I don't want to work alone or feel inadequately supported. I don't want to do a lot of administrative work. I don't want to sit all day. I don't want things to be too monotonous or the same. And it was like the proportion, when I looked at my two lists, I was like, I'm doing everything on this list of stuff that's tough going for me. And I'm doing almost nothing on this other list. Like it wasn't, the ratio was just way off because, that sort of meatheadedness, persistent, I'm going to finish this project at any cost. Like I can see the solution over the horizon. I had kind of just not really taken a step back to say, how's this actually affecting my well-being when I get up in the morning and I'm trying to look forward to the day?
Right.
Yeah. So, and the result of that was that when I really took a step back, that was when I decided to go to social work school. So I was 35 and I thought, why am I going to social work school? To develop a professional community.
Okay.
That was top of the list. To give myself a recognizable credential and practicing license that I can use to find a wide variety of different types of work, to get back to interacting directly with people like I did when I started off in Nepal. And that was pretty much it. And I knew that those were my priorities. It didn't really, I knew I was going to get that much that out of it. And then of course there was a whole journey, and going through there. So, and I'm kind of on the other side of that pivot.
Right.
Now. So I've done my degree. I learned, I added on a specialization in human rights while I was doing my degree. And I feel like that juncture, if I was listening to a podcast about work, about career changes, to me, that's the transition that would be both the first kind of entry into the 20-year tunnel and these sort of this weird phase of like trial and error, but then also coming out the other end of it and taking so much that was gained and then in doing in a way something that looks like kind of just shifting over to a totally different lane. But the number of parallels that I find between running a dental care program in Nepal and working as a clinical social worker in a women's reentry home for people leaving prison are just endless. Like, it's really amazing to me how when you're really engaged with what you're doing, if you're growing, if you're developing yourself, then that growth applies to the next thing that you're going to do. And you know what that is because you come in with those skills and those perspective and toolbox, and you're able to see where you can make use of them. So
right.
That kind of brings us up to where we are now.
Yeah, no, I love the way you outlined that just now, the way you took the step back and you made that list. And I'm actually going to write up that list for the show notes, because I think that actually is a great checklist for people to think through various facets of how they might think through what next steps they might take, and for everyone, it's going to be somewhat different. But I love the way you just articulated that, because it really, you just walked us through a really great process for someone to really evaluate what's going to work for them, what's not going to work for them. And in fact, this whole picture that you've just painted, it's clear that your storytelling skills really almost take us along the ride with you, as if we really understand what you were thinking and allow us to see the view that you were looking at as you were experiencing it, as best as we can, of course. And it really, it's very, very helpful. It's both intriguing and interesting and helpful, I think, for people who are thinking about what's next and what they're doing. And so now you're at another juncture in some respects, because my understanding is that you're now living in the Boston area. You have your master's in social work. You are heading back to Nepal this summer for the first time since the pandemic started, which I know you're looking forward to, but you're also changing your engagement with the dental health program to some degree. I mean, you're still involved with it, but you are definitely changing your involvement with that to some degree, and making some other choices for yourself, right?
There's a lot that goes into that, and it's such an important thing. I think for people who feel like I've invested so much in this one thing, I can never really, and this was a thing that, like, I started it, and if I was just like, I'm done with this, there's no just quitting. The whole thing would just stop. There's a lot that can happen without me, but we weren't really at a stage where I could just kind of be like, I'm not doing this anymore. And that is a very tough place to be in a lot of ways. And your thinking and your understanding of yourself. First of all, COVID. Second of all, I had a baby. So there are a number of ways in which we were all forced to the point. And, I had to back off and create space, but other people also had to rise to the occasion. And it's been great team building for us. Like, I have just experienced a tremendous amount of joy. We still, I have meetings every week with our team in Nepal, and it's been just the ultimate joy and pleasure for me to see them moving into this space, taking that leadership. It's something that, I've been trying to engineer for probably, 7 or 8 years now, and somehow just couldn't quite figure out how to. And then, all of a sudden I couldn't go there. And then in addition to not being able to go there, I wasn't available at all for a few months, and things kind of had to ramp up after I had a baby. And plus the conditions with COVID, it's not, there's only so much input I could have from the peanut gallery about how to manage COVID in a rural dentistry program in Nepal while I'm in Connecticut or Boston. So that all happened. And in addition to that, what I would say is whenever we're trying to make a shift, it's very hard if we're only shifting away from something. Once I started to, go to social work school, have new ideas, explore the job market in Boston, get responses from, see myself in another role. Now, all of a sudden, there's an affirmative thing to support that change and that growth for me. I can see the ways that this new thing is going to feed me in ways that I'm no longer feeling nurtured in my old role. And it's going to challenge me in ways that I'm no longer being challenged. And I feel excited. And now all of a sudden that calculation of the cost of not evolving, of not moving away, it's a different cost calculation, because otherwise you only see all of the things that are going to be left behind. And it feels like the world is going to end, because that's literally the whole world. So I think all of those things have come together at the same time. And it's just been such a wonderful breath of fresh air to start these new roles here, to be managed by other people. Like I get to go to a job at a hospital where I, am handed my things that I'm supposed to do. I troubleshoot with those. I'm on my feet. I'm moving around. I'm working. I'm doing it. And then I'm finished. And the problems that you see at a hospital, they are so much bigger and more overwhelming that I can't be like, oh no, I need to sort of find you just do your part. And then you go and you take pleasure in the interactions you have and the colleagues you have. So I think I had to, in some way, bring that possibility into my life before I could fully feel how much I needed it in order to regenerate and to keep growing and, to keep moving in a whatever direction I want to be in for whatever contribution that I want to make in the world.
Absolutely. And we all evolve and we all change as our lives grow. I mean, definitely. And so the things that we want to contribute based on that and based on those reflections, we're going to have to move on to some new things. I mean, as they say, change is the only constant. And you can still continue to make the impact you want to make on the program in Nepal without necessarily having to be the rainmaker for every piece of it, right?
Well, and we have to be open, to what happens when we let go of things too. So, there's ways in which things are going to be different than I would have innovated them, or some things may not last, or the next thing, or the next thing, or the next thing. And I think we all know that intellectually, but it's very difficult when you've invested yourself in something so much to be able to create that space. But sometimes really good things come out of that. Sometimes it's time for somebody else to start creating. And even when you know that, it's not a matter of selfishness. Even when you know that, it can be very hard to figure out how to actually do it. Because what's the day where you get up and you're like, I'm no longer interacting with this thing the way that I was interacting with it yesterday. So I really empathize. Like I really feel that quandary for people. And, that was my experience. It required the step that needed to be taken first was less the letting go. And it was more, it's like the way we work in social work is from a strength-based perspective. When somebody is really struggling with something, you don't just focus on how are we going to get rid of I'm not saying that sounds like a very negative framing of my work, but it's not all about how do I separate or pull back from this one thing. It's like, first let's develop, let's put more resources in. Let's figure out where the strengths are. Let's build up more things to go towards. And it's the same way that I, work as a social worker with people who even are, it seems like there's nothing to work, like they're leaving prison. They've been in prison for 10, 15 years. Like, where are the strengths? Well, let's figure out what it is. And if that strength is the one family member who you can, if that strength is a skill that you have, if that strength is an interest that you have, like, you start there.
That's right.
And then once there's more nutrients available, then it starts to be more feasible to change and grow in any way. And it's not even, I didn't experience this as a negative shift. It doesn't feel like a bad thing. It actually feels like growth for all of us.
Absolutely.
And that's been a big relief.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this has been amazing. I want to thank you, Laura, for your time today, for taking us on this amazing journey. And in closing, is there anything else you want to make sure that you leave our listeners with? I think you've given them quite a bit, but I want to make sure that there's nothing else that you wanted to add.
No, I don't think so. I think, okay, I feel like I should come up with something.
No, you don't have to. I feel like you've given us quite a bit. And so I just wanted to make sure
what I'm going to say is fear.
Yes.
Fear is a very interesting and useful thing. And it's amazing what we can do and the ways that we can change and pursue things when we kind of look at if what we're afraid of is something that makes sense, or if it's a story that we've been told, or a belief system that we have is okay to let go of. And sometimes just accepting this might not go quite right. Like, the scary thing might happen and actually I can be okay. If the scary thing happens, can be sometimes sometimes that's the way that we find the direction that we want to go in with work or with something else.
Yeah.
So that's my deep thought for the day.
I love it. Thank you. I love that. I think fear can be very useful. Sometimes it's a warning sign that we're going into territory that leaves us feeling unsafe. And sometimes it's a signal that there's some excitement ahead, something positive. So it can go either way, like you said.
Sometimes it's completely an illusion. And once you welcome it in, it just goes away because it wasn't actually a thing. So
I love that. Welcome it in. Well, I'm so glad that I welcomed you in because I love your story, every bit of it. And there will be tons of resources and information in the show notes. Laura, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. This is really lovely.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Laura Spero. It was so interesting to speak with her and learn about her background and professional transitions. What is your key takeaway from our interview? If you're interested in any of the resources mentioned in today's podcast, you can find them in the show notes on my website at tammygulerloeb.com/podcast. Just look for episode 180. Are you anticipating your next professional move? Check out my new book, Work from the Inside Out, Break Through 9 Common Obstacles and Design a Career That Fulfills You. It's available in print and ebook editions through my website, Amazon Worldwide, Barnes & Noble, independent bookstores, and through your local public library. If you are inspired by this episode with Laura, please share it with your friends and colleagues. And please also subscribe so you don't miss next week's show. Remember, subscribing is always free. Are you enjoying the podcast? I'd really appreciate reading your review on Apple Podcasts. It's easy to find through my website at tammygulerloeb.com/podcast. Just click on the Apple Podcast button and follow the instructions provided there. Thank you so much for listening. And remember, it's never too late or too impossible to increase your sense of fulfillment and satisfaction in your work and other meaningful activities. Let me know how it's going for you. I'd love to hear from you. Bye for now.
Thank you for listening to the Work from the Inside Out podcast. For more information, you can find us at www.workfromtheinsideout.com.